So we want to add basically a focal point, a point in the scene that we can add like a depth of field to, essentially, so that we have a way of controlling what's in focus and what's out of focus. And the way that we are going to do that is in our like main collection here. I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to add an empty plane axis. Now you can see here we've got this empty object, and it's just a marker for an object. There's nothing in it. It doesn't render. It's just an empty object, and we're going to use this as our focal point. So I'm going to rename this to DOF because that's how I name all my depth of field objects. And then I'm going to go into my camera. I'm going to go into my camera settings by clicking on this little green thing here. It's going to bring up my camera settings down here. I'm going to jump into my camera view, and then I am going to start configuring my depth of field by going into my camera settings, turning on depth of field, and adding focus on object. I'm going to go up here and I'm going to click on DOF. That's going to be my focal object. And then everything now is going to be slightly blurry the further away from my depth of field object we get. So this is going to simulate that kind of that depth of field effect that you would get from any camera, any real world camera that's operating on in normal conditions. You are going to have some degree of depth of field effect happening. We can change the intensity of that depth of field effect in a couple of ways. We can reduce the f-stop. So the further we get to or closer we get to zero, the more extreme the depth of field effect we get. This compounds with how close you are to an object. So if we move our camera way further away, then the depth of field effect is going to be less pronounced the further away we're focusing. But the closer we get to an object, the more intense our depth of field effect will get. Now, if you want to kind of see the exact result of your render here, and you don't want to see these viewport overlays, you can just flick this button on and off here at the top. You just turn that on and off so that you can kind of get a better look at exactly how things are going to render. So yeah, that's pretty much the depth of field element here. So that's pretty straightforward. And then another thing to note with the camera is just like this focal length here. So focal length will dramatically change the way you're looking at or perceiving a scene. So we take this down to 18 millimeters. We get this effect where everything that's really close to the camera, so where's our camera here? Our camera's, if we turn back on the viewport overlays, camera's right here. You can see everything that's really close to the camera is getting like emphasized and made more kind of dramatic. So it makes everything very close to the camera appear really large, and it pushes these background objects way into the background. It kind of skews and distorts the view so that you're just pushing those objects back into the background. You also get much more of your surroundings in one of these kind of with a really low focal length. If we go the opposite direction, let's say we use a 100mm lens, we get a very flat, almost orthographic look. So it really flattens out the scene and creates this kind of much more, I guess, documentary style, orthographic, floor plan-y kind of aesthetic. So the longer the lens you use, the flatter the environment, and the shorter the lens you use, the more emphasized and dramatized the things that are closer to the camera will be. So this can be a really good tool to use in composition to just try and like configure interesting and different views of a scene. So in this scene, we've got these kind of a much more kind of a dramatic dramatic scene, I guess. Cool. So that's probably it when it comes to camera. I don't think there's much else to talk about here. I would just stick to just adjusting focal length and your depth of field object. Don't even think any of these will really make that dramatic a difference. Like you could try and emulate some classic lenses. You can try and create like rotation in the lens to create like a swirly effect, but generally I don't think you'll notice it, especially not in Eevee. Eevee tends to be pretty neutral with how it treats camera effects, although you may notice it if we switch over to cycles. So let's do that. Just not because I suggest you use cycles. In fact, I suggest you use Eevee because it's a much more versatile and quick rendering engine. But we will I will just go through some aspects of cycles here. And then, actually, I might do this first. Let's just make sure we know how to render and output an image in a way that in a format that we want. So if we flick over to this little format or scene here, scene menu here in the properties menu, this is where we can configure things like output resolution. 1920 by 1080 is probably fine. You can go higher if you want. Eevee will handle that pretty well. If you want to go here, you can go like, let's do like 4K, right? So we can render out a 4K image. You'll notice that if you change any of these, you're changing the letterboxing here, so it's updating or adapting to the resolution that you are going to render out at. And then, nothing much else here except for maybe changing the output directory. So making sure that you are outputting to your pictures folder, for example. Let's accept that. And then you're saving file extensions. You can save in a whole bunch of different formats if you really want to. You can save it in OpenEXR, which is a raw file, and then put that into something like Photoshop or Lightroom maybe to configure your to like basically control it like you would a regular photograph. So you can do a bunch of stuff here if you really want to. What I tend to do is I don't want to go through the process of putting things through Photoshop and things like that. So there are a few kind of color management and post-processing options in here that you can use. Okay, so this might be a little awkward of a drop-in, but I did want to just clarify some stuff about color management within the rendering engine in Blender. So when you are exporting an image, or when you're kind of viewing an image on screen, you can actually manage the brightness and contrast like you would in Photoshop or Lightroom from this color management section in the render settings tab in the render properties. So just be aware that there is a color management setting in the output settings here as well. But this applies when you are rendering out large sections of an animation, and it doesn't apply in the viewport or on specific renders that you might bring up, like specific frames that you might render with like the F12 key, for example. So if you create a render this way, then you might you might not get the results you want necessarily. So we're gonna go into color management in the render tab, and in here we should be able to actually control certain elements of our contrast and color display. So we can kind of switch over to some like different kinds of viewport transforms here, but I think the best thing to do is leave that on none and don't touch any of these, but instead click on this use curves button here and dial in your curves as you would in Photoshop. So if you want higher contrast, you kind of create more of an S curve here. That's probably a little bit much, but you can create these points and be quite specific and how you apply them. But yeah, if you want slightly more contrast, then you kind of want to bring these lower values down a little bit, and that will give you slightly more contrast. If you want to kind of like just soften the dark values a little bit, you can pull up that bottom kind of very bottom dark values little node there. And if you want to kind of emphasize the intensity of things, you can kind of play around with the curves to get different results. So that's hopefully just gonna, I'll just drop that in. We'll drop this into the rest of the video, and then I'll explain a little bit about the output settings. But if I do in this in the following section mention post-processing or anything like that, just ignore that and do all your render processing or all of your color management processing in the render tab, because that will mean that when you do hit F12, those same curves are applied to your output image. This one's a little gross, but yeah, you wanna just kind of like dial things in the way you want to.